The story begins in a corner of Georgia where the mornings smell like pine and the nights hum with crickets loud enough to drown out your thoughts. Dalton isn't the kind of place you'd expect a double homicide to bloom. People there still wave from pickup trucks, still gossip at diners, still trust their neighbors enough to borrow sugar without knocking twice. And that's exactly why the murders hit harder than a hammer to the chest, because violence wasn't supposed to belong here. Danielle Morrah was the heartbeat of her community, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and instantly soften it. Her students said she radiated calm like a scented candle that never burned out. She talked slow, breathed slow, lived slow, like the world would speed up only if she allowed it. A yoga teacher with an open-door policy and a spine steelier than folks realized. Her husband, Marcus, was the opposite. Loud laugh, fast hands, the sort of guy who could fix anything except his own worries. He adored Danielle, everyone saw that. The way he watched her during her classes, as if the sun rose straight out of her ribcage. They were the couple you pointed at and said, "Yeah, that's what love's supposed to look like." Which is why the crime scene felt so wrong, so out of place, so violently out of tune. The night before the murders, several neighbors heard something strange, a sound like a door slamming hard, followed by a woman's voice, sharp and breathless, cut off as quickly as it rose. But nobody called it in. In Dalton, people mind their business unless the sky is falling, and even then they peek through curtains before stepping outside. But the next morning, a delivery driver knocked and got no answer. He looked through the window and saw something he would never unsee. Danielle lying on the living room floor, still as stone. The driver froze, knocked again, called out, but the silence that answered him was heavier than a storm cloud. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers. When deputies entered the home, the air felt thick, like fear had seeped into the walls overnight. Danielle was gone. Marcus was gone. No struggle signs beyond a couple of overturned items. Nothing stolen. No forced entry. Just two bodies, two lives swallowed whole by a monster nobody could yet name. The sheriff stood in the center of the room and said something that stuck with every officer who heard it. This wasn't spur of the moment. Someone came here on purpose. Rumors spread before the coroner even arrived. The Morrah family was well liked, but popularity in small towns doesn't protect you from whispers. It only sharpens them. And soon the hot name floating around was a couple who lived in a modern white mansion just a quarter-mile away. Clara and Thomas Whitford. You didn't talk about Clara without lowering your voice. She had that reputation, half admired, half feared, elegant, wealthy, hosting wellness retreats that cost more than people's monthly rent. She had a following too, women who swore she changed their lives, people who treated her like a spiritual guru wrapped in flawless skin and expensive linen. Danielle was starting to gain traction in the same scene, slowly but noticeably. Her classes were filling up, her social media was growing. A small-town buzz was forming around her name. And Clara? Clara didn't share stages. She didn't like competition. She especially didn't like competition that didn't bow to her. Detectives learned quickly that the Whitfords had tension with the Morrahs. Financial tension, contractual tension, personal tension. Marcus had been renovating the Whitford home, but delays stacked up. Thomas was notorious for his temper when things didn't go his way. Witnesses said he yelled at Marcus more than once. Danielle stepped in once to defend her husband, and Clara heard about it. People say Clara doesn't forget slights, big or small. So naturally, when the Morrahs turned up dead, small-town logic drew a straight line right to the Whitford doorstep. But wealthy people don't panic easily, and when the cops came knocking, Thomas opened the door like he'd been expecting a brunch guest. Clara sat behind him, sipping herbal tea with her legs crossed, looking like grief was something she'd never need to learn. Their alibi was clean. Too clean. Dinner party. Dozens of guests, doorbell camera footage, champagne bottles clinking in the background. Their timeline didn't even bend, much less break. So the detectives stepped back, their gut screaming one thing, the evidence whispering another. But cops don't stop at whispers. They dig. And that's when they found the message. On Danielle's phone, a text sent to her best friend at 10:47 p.m. the night before. "I swear someone's been following me. I don't know who, but I feel watched." Those last two words, "feel watched," hit investigators like an ice bucket. Because when a person senses danger without proof, it usually means one thing. The threat is close. Close enough to breathe the same air. They followed the thread backward. They checked her student list, her messages, her appointments. And there, hiding in plain sight, was a man who had slipped into her life like fog under a door. Elias Varron. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't a co-worker. He wasn't even a long-time student. He was something in between, a private client who had crossed the line between spiritual seeker and obsessive follower. Danielle had tried distancing herself after he grew intense. He asked for extra sessions, asked personal questions, stared too long, talked too little. She mentioned him to a few friends, brushing it off like he was just eccentric. They didn't realize eccentric could turn into dangerous overnight. Detectives discovered that Elias had once worked closely with Clara Whitford, her energy coach, whatever that meant. He spent months guiding her through some kind of spiritual cleanse. People said Clara trusted him more than her own husband. Elias thought she was his greatest student. He admired her, worshipped her, maybe even loved her in a way that twisted his judgment. And when Clara grew distant from him, guess who she began praising publicly? Danielle. Detectives began to trace a line darker than jealousy, one rooted in obsession, control, and emotional manipulation. They checked Elias's house. It was empty except for a few candles, piles of notebooks, and a corkboard covered in photos. Some of Clara, but more of Danielle. Danielle teaching, Danielle walking, Danielle unlocking her car, Danielle laughing outside her studio. A timeline of her life pinned neatly like she was a specimen under glass. Then came the detail that made even the seasoned detectives nauseous. Elias had scribbled phrases all over the walls in black marker. "Imbalance must be corrected. She is the light blocking the path. Manifest through action. Clara shows the way." The investigators didn't know whether to treat Elias as a puppet or a puppeteer. All they knew was that this man believed he was doing sacred work. Violent, sacred work. They issued a warrant. They searched the woods, the highways, the state lines. The whole county held its breath because a killer walking free is bad enough. But a killer who thinks he's chosen? That's a nightmare untamed. Then, without warning, Elias walked into the sheriff's office barefoot, calm, almost floating. He placed his hands on the counter and whispered, "I returned balance." The deputies backed away like they'd seen a ghost peel off its own shadow. Elias didn't resist. He didn't panic. He didn't apologize. He simply watched the officers with vague curiosity, as though they were children studying an interesting bug. In the interrogation room, he talked like a preacher unraveling a sermon only he understood. She opened channels that weren't hers. She absorbed what didn't belong to her. She threatened the alignment that Clara built. Every answer circled back to Clara Whitford. Every motive echoed her influence. Every justification sounded like something she'd whispered into his ear long before the murders. When detectives confronted Clara with this information, her serenity cracked right down the center. The soft-spoken guru vanished. What emerged was a woman cornered, terrified that her perfect image might rot in public. She denied knowing anything. She denied guiding him. She denied ever telling Elias to correct anything, but her messages betrayed her. Text after text, Voice notes, half-spoken instructions wrapped in spiritual language. She never said, kill, but she said things like, remove the block, restore harmony, do what must be done. You are my instrument. The kind of language a disturbed mind could twist into violence. The deeper detectives dug, the uglier the connection became. Elias wasn't a random follower. He was molded, conditioned, fed beliefs that inflated his delusions until they swallowed him whole. And Clara? She benefited from it. She used him to do what she didn't have the nerve to do herself. Danielle's rising popularity threatened Clara's empire. Marcus's renovation issues threatened Thomas's pride. Together, the Morrahs became an unwanted inconvenience, and Elias became the solution. He was the tool. Clara was the hand holding it. Thomas stood by and watched, and the town of Dalton learned the kind of lesson that scars a place forever. Sometimes the most dangerous killers aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones standing in the front row of charity galas, smiling for the cameras, pretending their hands are clean. The sheriff once said the Morrah investigation felt like peeling an onion soaked in gasoline. Every new layer stung, and every new reveal made the whole case burn hotter. And part 2 of this story is where everything people thought they knew about the murders gets flipped inside out. Once Elias Varron was in custody, the town took a collective breath, thinking the nightmare was over. But detectives weren't satisfied. Something in Elias's confession didn't sit right. He spoke like a man who believed he had done holy work. Not a desperate man, not a cornered man, but someone who thought the world should thank him. He didn't describe the killings with anger or fear. He described them like a ritual, a cleansing, a performance done for an audience he worshipped. And that audience was Clara Whitford. Detectives dug deeper into every conversation between Clara and Elias, and slowly the true dynamic bloomed like a poison flower. Clara had a gift, not spiritual power, not some mystical influence, but something much more dangerous: the ability to make vulnerable people believe she was their savior. She wrapped her words in silk. She made people feel chosen. She fed their insecurities until they mistook her manipulation for enlightenment. Elias had once been lost, grieving a breakup, struggling financially, drifting without purpose. Clara swooped in at the perfect moment, presenting herself as a guide. She taught him her own twisted brand of spirituality. She told him the universe worked in energy debts, that some people blocked others' paths, that unbalanced forces must be neutralized. Words meant to sound poetic, but to a mind like Elias's, they were a roadmap. The more detectives uncovered, the clearer it became. Clara didn't tell Elias to kill. She didn't have to. She just planted seeds, watered them with validation, and stepped back as they grew into a monster wearing human skin. Still, proving manipulation in court is like trying to catch fog with your bare hands. They needed something stronger than influence, something that screamed direct involvement. So they dug into Clara's financial records, and that's when the floor caved in. Large cash transfers, unexplained withdrawals, payments labeled as consultation fees given to Elias over a 3-month period. The amount wasn't enough to scream contract killing, but enough to suggest a dangerous relationship built on dependency and power. Then came the discovery that changed the entire trajectory of the case: a private email exchange between Clara and Elias 3 weeks before the murders. Clara had written, "You must protect what we've built. Anyone trying to disrupt the alignment must be removed from our space." Elias responded, "I will restore balance. Tell me when." Clara replied with a voice note that simply said, "Soon." That one word, soon, hung in the air like a thundercloud. Detectives replayed it over and over, listening for tone, intent, anything. And there it was. Not fear, not hesitation, not surprise. The voice of someone expecting an outcome. Someone who knew the direction the storm was blowing. While detectives prepared charges against Clara, Thomas Whitford found himself under the microscope too. At first, he acted like a man shocked by everything, eyes wide, hands shaking, pretending he knew nothing about Elias or his wife's hidden dealings. But the truth seeped in eventually. Thomas knew enough. He'd heard Clara's rants about Marcus. He'd seen her obsession with Danielle. He'd witnessed her late-night talks with Elias. He never participated, but he never stopped anything either. And in the eyes of the law, silence can be a crime. While investigators continued building the case, the people of Dalton spiraled into arguments at diners, church steps, grocery aisles. Some refused to believe Clara was involved. They admired her too deeply, trusted her too blindly. Others said they always sensed something off in her smile. Too still, one woman said, like she practiced emotions instead of feeling them. Then came a turning point nobody expected. Elias asked to speak to detectives again. He sat in the interview room calmer than any man facing life in prison had a right to be. He said he had more to clarify because he needed the truth aligned. He claimed Clara didn't order the killing outright. He insisted he acted for her, not by her request. He painted Clara like a star he followed blindly, a light he needed, a voice he worshipped. He said the murders were necessary because Danielle disturbed the spiritual frequency Clara had cultivated. Detectives pressed him hard. Did Clara tell him to kill? Did Thomas encourage violence? Was there a meeting? A plan? Elias shook his head slowly every time, as if the questions themselves offended him. "No one told me," he said. "I acted because the universe spoke through her." That line became infamous. Newspapers printed it. News channels replayed it. People whispered it like a spell gone bad. But its real effect was legal. It made Clara's defense complicated. She couldn't claim innocence. Too much evidence tied her influence to Elias's actions, but she could claim she never intended murder. And intent is everything in court. While the legal teams began their war, detectives uncovered one more piece of the puzzle, one that tied everything together in a way that made even experienced officers shiver. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage from the night before the murders. Not of the Morrah home, but of the woods behind the Whitford mansion. A shadow moving, tall, thin, barefoot. Elias. He wasn't at the Whitford dinner party, as Clara claimed. He was waiting in the dark, pacing in slow, deliberate circles, like a predator preparing for a hunt. And Clara? She'd stepped outside twice that night, even in the cold, standing at the edge of the patio, staring into the trees. The footage didn't catch her speaking, but her body language said enough. She wasn't startled. She wasn't confused. She was calm, expecting something, someone. That video became the blade that sliced through her pure innocence narrative. Prosecutors argued that Clara orchestrated the psychological setup. Elias acted as the executioner. Thomas shielded her from consequences. When the trial began, the courthouse was packed wall to wall. Reporters lined the sidewalk. People drove in from nearby towns just to stand outside and gossip in the cold. The case became a Southern tragedy, a soap opera wrapped in spiritual language and homicide. Elias pled guilty immediately. No deal, no fight, just acceptance. When asked if he regretted anything, he replied, "I regret that balance required pain, but I do not regret restoring it." The courtroom froze. Clara fought every step. Her lawyers painted Elias as a deranged stalker who misinterpreted her words. They claimed she was a victim, too, of obsession, of misunderstanding, of a twisted follower who warped her spiritual teachings into violence. But prosecutors brought receipts, her messages, her voice recordings, her financial ties, her presence near the woods, her obsessive jealousy, Elias's worshipful descriptions of her power, and most damning, the undeniable fact that Danielle was rising in the same wellness circle Clara dominated. competition disguised as enlightenment. By the time the closing arguments rang out, even people who once adored Clara sat stiffly in their seats, seeing through her carefully constructed aura. The verdict came down like thunder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of coercion, guilty of reckless influence resulting in death. Thomas was found guilty of obstruction, of protecting Clara, of hiding her involvement, of valuing reputation over justice. Elias received life without parole. Clara received decades behind bars. Thomas received years that stripped away everything his wealth had ever protected. But the part of the story nobody forgets is what happened after the sentencing. Danielle's yoga studio reopened, not as a business, not as a brand, but as a memorial. Students lit candles, friends left handwritten notes. A photograph of Danielle teaching her last class hung near the door, sunlight caught perfectly in her hair. People said the room felt different now, quieter, heavier, yet strangely peaceful, like her presence lingered in the air she had once poured her spirit into. And as for the Whitford mansion, it stayed empty. Lights off, curtains drawn, a monument to the truth that even the wealthiest lives can rot from the inside when power and obsession intertwine. People still talk about the case. They call it Southern Noir, like it belongs on a bookshelf of crime novels. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. This story didn't happen in a movie. It happened in a town just like yours. A place where people smile on porches. A place where leaders preach peace. A place where trust is a currency. A place where nobody ever suspected evil would bloom. But evil doesn't need permission. It doesn't need a mask. Sometimes it wears a linen dress, speaks softly, lights candles, and calls itself enlightened. Sometimes it hides in the person everyone admires. Sometimes it hides in the person everyone ignores. And sometimes it hides in the space between them, where manipulation feels like devotion, and devotion becomes a weapon. The Morrah case taught the world one brutal truth. The most dangerous killers aren't always the ones who force their way into your home. Sometimes they're the ones you welcome inside, and that's why Dalton will never forget the night balance became blood. Because in the quiet South, monsters don't growl, they whisper.